Welcome, everyone. This is episode 24 of the Brandon Adams podcast. I have with me Richard Davies. He's a fellow at the London School of Economics. He was the economics editor at The Economist. He was a speechwriter at the Bank of England. And he's most recently the author of the book Extreme Economies: Survival, Failure, Future, Lessons from the World's Limits. Richard, welcome.
Brandon, thanks for having me on.
I loved your book. This was an incredibly entertaining book that was part travelogue, part global economics primer. Now, I as I was reading this book, I have to confess that I was imagining that you might come on the podcast, and I was eager to pick your brain because I noticed that it's clear your knowledge of economics is incredibly deep, and it's clear that you're incredibly insightful. However, you have this way of holding your cards a little close to your vest. You might know by background, I'm a poker player, and it makes you withhold information in every setting. And I know probably because you have one foot in policy, you probably have a similar tendency to withhold information. And I would challenge anyone to guess your political or economic views having read this book, because you kind of hold your cards closely in that regard. Is that fair?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I think so. But that is fair. But I'm also very happy to discuss sort of where I got to. But it was more that the book was a really an opportunity for me. So I started doing it and started researching actually back in 2016, just after the UK's EU referendum, where I'd gone off and actually worked as an advisor to our Chancellor of the Exchequer, so our finance ministry, in a position that was appointed, sort of chosen by him. And when the EU referendum went wrong, from the perspective of the side, if you want, that I was working for, essentially all of those positions got cut. And so I suddenly, for the first time, had some time on my hands, and that was one formative experience. Basically, we as the economics and policy community had completely misread the way people felt about globalization and trade and immigration. And then that cast back to my time in my sort of mid to early 20s at the Bank of England, where we'd completely missed the great financial crisis. And so I wanted to go off on this trip. You know, it's the kind of trip of a lifetime, really, these 9 places, 100,000 miles of travel, and tried to start with a blank sheet. So I'm glad that it comes across that way, because I didn't want this to be a book which goes with a preconceived notion that, you know, markets and economics are good or bad. I really genuinely tried to be objective and just write down what I found in each place. And it's a mix, as you might imagine.
It's fascinating. I was in London at the time of the referendum. I went for a different reason for Wimbledon, but I remember the shock on the streets, the shock in financial markets, the shock in betting markets as this 10-to-1 dog scenario came through.
Big shock in betting markets, right? Because we were there the day before, and I don't know if anyone's written the history of this down, but a hedge fund, and I can't remember who it was, had done their own private polling and said that, you know, it was definitely going to be, the vote was going to be for Remain, and suddenly people were sort of tweeting about betting markets had it, you know, 9-10-1. And then it was completely wrong. So yeah, some people got burned there.
Yeah, well, betting markets had it priced the same way as financial markets, pretty much, which was about there 9 or 10-1, nearly a lock, and it was one of the most active betting markets of all times. You can never guess what is going to be bet. Like, for instance, the presidential election in 2012 was extremely heavily bet in both directions. It was just insanely popular to bet on that presidential race. Whereas the presidential race today it seems like interesting, and it seems like there would be a lot of difference of opinion, but there's just not a lot of appetite to bet on it. And that referendum, there was an insane amount of action. So people were betting like hundreds of thousands of dollars on each side of that kind of 1.1 euro odds kind of price. And then as the news came in that it might go the other way, the betting market shifted and the futures crushed and all that sort of stuff had happened very quickly. And I guess the way that you guys do the exit polling or something, what I remember uniquely about that was, unlike the presidential election where the news sort of unfolds over hours, it literally unfolded over like 1 hour.
So what happens is that individual, and it's the same really in all elections, but individual local authorities collect together their own votes. And over time it's become this like a sort of matter of pride to see who can do it quickest. And I think I'm right in saying it's Sunderland in the north of England, northeast of England, literally like the whole county sort of gets together collecting because they want it to be a news item that their result will come out first. And so because of that, you get this thing of like 5 to 10 places sort of all announced really quite quickly. And then you can sort of correlate the likely voting intention of those places, where it came out, and get a pretty good view of which way things are going to go.
So that came as a personal and professional shock, and then you sort of transitioned to this project that you had in mind for a little while.
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this for quite a while. Two kind of things. One, again, even before Brexit, working at the Bank of England and in the City of London through 2006 to about 2011, I think it was a really formative experience, just seeing everything around you melt down. I mean, I was in the bank. I remember sitting there. Famously, we were having about what was then known as the Great Stability that week, and it just is sort of hushed whispers went round when Northern Rock, which was the first UK bank to fail, was a mortgage lender, failed. And then, in the weeks and months that followed, we had G20 riots, people actually rioting outside the Bank of England. And that's something you just never thought you'd see as a calm and sort of calculated profession of central banking. And clearly we're missing something. And in the way we look and do economics and tell stories about economics. And the reason I think that matters is because I think we know, in the sense I don't think there's much uncertainty, some trends that we can get a handle on. So we didn't know we were going to have a pandemic this year. But there are some things that are going to happen over the next 10 years, which we can pretty much put a fairly big bet on happening. And those are the demographic shift that we're seeing, the rise of technology, and particularly technology adopted by the state, sort of digital society, digital government, and also the rise of inequality. And those things are going to happen. And they all bring really big uncertainties. So the fact that we don't do, for example, central banking, which is something we've been working on really hard for, since the Bretton Woods era, very well, makes me a little bit concerned about these trends that we're facing. And so I wanted to kind of go off and investigate them.
I was very curious about where exactly you stood. So I'm going to make some guesses now, and you can tell me how I do. I believe that we both share a deep belief in free markets and markets generally. I also believe that we both think that that politics and history are deeply interwoven and perhaps dominant over pure economics. I believe that we're both deeply concerned about inequality, and particularly the way that our politicized markets now lead to inequality. And now I'm going to reach a little bit more. I wonder if your interest in the extreme economies, if you see that in some ways these places where things are currently broken, these economies that are a little bit on the periphery now, where things are in some ways broken, or they've had to adapt to difficult circumstances, if it says something about the future in the center, in places like the US and the UK and Europe. Because to be honest, when I ordered the book the moment that I heard about it. I pre-ordered it many months ago, and I pre-ordered it because I do kind of believe that in the US, say, we're on a bad path and have been on a bad path for a while. And I was thinking, learning about extreme economies, like learning about the Mad Max economy, might be actually really valuable. It might be an important playbook.
Yeah. So on that, I liked your sort of summary of sort of political economy, I guess. But just to start with that last point, look, cards on the table, kind of extreme economies. I worked as a journalist. I realized you need a decent title to get people to read your article, and it's a sort of interesting and potentially eye-catching idea for a book. I really did and do hope that it has a kind of bigger idea, and it's one that I touch on in the intro, but I actually don't give much sort of autobiographical stuff. But the autobiographical link is that I actually started out as a medical student. So I studied medicine, and then I switched to philosophy, politics, and economics. And one of the things in medicine that strikes you when you move to studying economics is the sort of dominance of the feeling within economics that you need to look at the entire distribution. You need to think mainly about the median, but then you want to talk about sort of distance from the median, and that's in unemployment and growth rates and whatever the thing is you're looking at. And that's just not the way science has progressed. And so one of the cases I talk about right at the start is this famous British anatomist called William Harvey, who discovered circulation. He discovered the way blood circulates around the body. And he did this precisely by looking at cases of people who had an injury. One young man famously that kind of should have died, but they'd survived. And because of that, he was able to study, literally by looking through their rib cages, the way that the mechanics worked. And that's the sort of first example I could find of like extreme science. But it goes on, and very famously, there's the guy. I guess if you haven't heard of Harvey, you've probably heard of Phineas Gage, because I think it happened in the States or maybe in Canada. This guy who had like a metal rod shot through his head, and it sort of separated the lobes of his brain. And that one extreme case, so not a distribution of people, not a median, but literally one abnormal, odd event, form the basis of huge amounts of experiments in neurology and the way modern neurology works. So definitely, I think that there's a lot of soul searching going on in economics at the moment about how to sort of improve it and so on. And my sort of small contribution, I hope, with this book is to say, just look at the sciences. We don't need to, as economists or social scientists more broadly, always obsess about our sample size and our microdata on billions of observations. Sometimes a simple story about one person, one refugee camp, which I cover, one high security prison where new money is involved, can tell us something about the way money in general works. And I think some people won't like that idea, but it's used by medics, and it has been for hundreds of years. So I hope it works in the book.
It very much does. And so the early chapter on the two largest Syrian refugee camps, or I believe they're the two largest.
Yeah, they are.
That's what gives me the sense that you believe strongly in free markets, and you are not opposed to inequality stemming directly from free markets, because in those camps, some people are living well on the basis of providing for needs that come up, and you have a favorable orientation towards that sort of success related to inequality. But then if we go to the end of the book and your chapter on Santiago, which I'd like to dive into for a bit, in talking about the inequality in Santiago, which has become a big problem, you seem to bemoan it because it's not really anymore the result of hard work and providing for needs, but rather building moats, working politics, sort of suppressing opportunity for some things, all the things that we hate about politicized markets. So I would really enjoy hearing about how you came to focus on Santiago, what you did to learn about it, and then maybe also, and I don't want to make the questions too grand, but I liked the book The Commanding Heights by Daniel Yergin in the late 90s, where he's looking at Eastern European economies that are transitioning quickly to free markets, and he's basically triumphalist about this change to free market, and he basically implies that we're never going to look back. This is a beautiful thing for the world and for these places. And at the same time, there were triumphalist articles coming out about places like Chile and talking about the basically the direct link from the University of Chicago and the deep free market orientation of the University of Chicago to policy in Chile, and how the policy led to extreme success. And basically the thinking in the late 90s was that Chile was always going to be the most successful place in Latin America because they had figured out how to make free markets work for them.
To answer your question about the kind of really big political economy question, the refugee camps chapter was a really interesting one, essentially because there's two of them. One's called Zaatari, the other's called Azraq. Zaatari is run on more or less a capitalist free market lines. Azraq is, by contrast, a complete command and control economy. And it's very difficult to go to those two places and see people under such duress whose lives have essentially been reduced to nothing. They're living in the Jordanian desert, having left all of their belongings back in Syria, and not come away from it invigorated and optimistic. Invigorated and optimistic about the way markets work. The Zaatari camp is full of entrepreneurs offering any number of goods and services you could want. It has a very high employment rate, and in general, people were, they're fleeing civil war, so they're not happy to be there. But they're within their choices, they're happy to be in that camp. And Azraq is the polar opposite. Very few entrepreneurs, few jobs, and the people there are they're kind of miserable. So in that chapter, yes, absolutely. It's an example of why in public policy, when we take steps to kind of crush the market instinct and the power of markets as a way of allocating goods and resources, that often leads to really bad outcomes. But then later, when I was in the Darien Gap, there was a complete adjustment or a shock to that, the way of thinking. I was there a few months later, where I saw this market that I discuss in the book, the market for teak, And I'll leave it to listeners if they're interested to take a look at that chapter. But every single market problem exists there. There are subsidies, there are tariffs that don't work, there's confusion of ownership rights, and the result is an economic market essentially for the environment, which destroys the environment. So in short, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer, but what I do think is that policy needs to be much tougher and bolder. And so a centre position that in general allows markets to flower and helps them flower, but in certain cases is way tougher on just eradicating dangerous markets is for me what I think is the way forward. But to come back to thinking about the future, a real test for our sort of variants of capitalism, our variants of how we're going to regulate markets is precisely Santiago, because that economy, as you touched on, as we got to the 1990s, was being talked about as, it was literally the poster child for economic development. And that's why I wanted to go there.
The 90s were a time when markets were deeply celebrated generally. It will probably be looked back upon as the height of the free markets within the US, just because it was a time that when Bill Clinton came into office, there were fears that he would be very much a statist president, that he would bring in Hillary and they would nationalize healthcare, and it would be very much anti-free market. In fact, Clinton turned out to be one of our most free market presidents, and those were booming years in the economy. Now we can debate whether that was demographics or just luck or related to .com or whatever. But they were good years in the economy. But within the economics profession, there was this free market triumphalism that related to the fact that we were relatively fresh from the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it had, say, from the perspective of the late 90s, you had this so-called shock therapy approach seemingly successfully applied in former USSR economies.
And in Chile, right? So I'm totally with you. I think it, and you can find documents that are online, published by the IMF and the World Bank from that period, with statements about learning the lessons from Chile, the Chile model, how to replicate Chilean economics. And that economics was precisely that kind of shock, privatization shock, which you discuss, which the Soviet, post-Soviet economies were encouraged to go through. But Chile had been through it in the late 70s, after the fall of the last communist or socialist government of Salvador Allende in the early 70s, 72. So, but it was literally that model was being expounded and exported by the global bodies, which are, we should have them, and in general they do a valuable job. But one of the things they do is they push out economic ideas around the world, and from Washington DC and also Geneva in terms of the WTO, this idea that the Chile model was going to be a successful model was being pushed really, really hard.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the differences between the Chile implementation and the Eastern European implementation was that in Eastern Europe, they were starting from ground zero. So the shock therapy, a lot of it was like, how do we get ownership of factories and companies from government hands to private hands as quickly as possible. And that basic move, it showed obvious successes in the early years, Whereas in Chile, they were starting from sort of an intermediate phase instead of starting from truly ground zero. And because they were starting from an intermediate phase, they were concerned a bit about education policy and health policy and these sort of less primal, more intermediate stage concerns. And basically the Chicago school thinking about things like education and health, which was insanely free market, like the Gary Becker, like let education be entirely free market, let healthcare be entirely free market, let even prisons be entirely free market, like let everything be market. That extreme Chicago school thinking, which was very fashionable at the time. I mean, we forget now that Gary Becker won a Nobel Prize. Like he was a very influential thinker. But he had extreme free market views, and that's what was implemented in Chile, which was quite a bit different than the implementation in Eastern Europe.
I think that's fair. So on the, I mean, there's a difference of kind of 20 years. Chile's happening sort of 20 years before. So it's, roughly 72 versus 92, 1972 versus 1992. And you're definitely right in that Chile is more intermediate. I forget the numbers off the top of my head. They're there in the chapter, but there's some striking statistics on things like, for example, the number of state-owned companies in Chile, which had been, let's say it was like 50, and then under the last socialist government of Allende, it went up to, let's say, 100. And then when Pinochet took over, didn't know anything about economics, military dictator, obviously, he called up on these Chicago-trained economists who had been off to the University of Chicago, had come back, and really had been working in academia and hadn't had much impact. Frankly, they'd improved teaching at the university, modernized, they would say, and I got a chance to interview them, and they do say the way economics was done, but didn't have any real policy impact, and had put together this blueprint, literally a thick economic playbook known as the BRIC. Became known as the BRIC, and Pinochet hired these guys to actually impose those policies, those Chicago-inspired policies, to the economy. And so the reason your intermediate level question is right is the number of state-owned enterprises had a base level, went up a bit, and then they unwound everything that the socialists had done, and then went further and further and further until it was down to just a handful of state-owned enterprises. So it was really like a petri dish of almost complete control of the best economic thinking, because it's not just Gary Becker, right? It's Milton Friedman, and there are, apart from, I would as a Brit say Keynes. When the long history of economics is written, there are few people of the last century that are anywhere near either Keynes or Friedman, and Friedman then was in his pomp. It was the time when he had sort of TV shows and was starting to put out general interest books. And so that was really the cutting edge and the best that economics had to offer. And the really interesting thing is that because of the terrible events and the dictatorship, those ideas, these economists got almost free rein on a whole economy. The initial results were very bad. It took about 6 to 8 years for things to improve. But then you just got this annual, year-on-year, really strong growth numbers, really low inflation numbers, poverty, which is the way that the Chicago boys still assess their own track record, not by inequality, but by poverty. So the poverty rate, and to give them their due, does really tumble as growth increases. And it's at this point that the IMF and the World Bank and everybody in the mid to late 90s starts talking about how do we replicate the Chile model? How do we make all emerging markets jump to advanced, as Chile eventually did, along this successful path.
You have Argentina, which as the Chileans and Argentinians, they really dislike each other for one reason or another. But Argentina, they were encouraged by Chile's success and adopted a more free market orientation in slightly later years. And then in Peru, there was a roughly similar trajectory 15 years later under the Fujimori. And in all cases, it led to really societal upheavals. So at the time you're examining Santiago, they're in the midst of this kind of upheaval, which seemingly relates to inequality, and also maybe the fact that they were ostensibly free markets, but in actuality, once free markets had operated for a while and a wealth divide had taken place, the people who were wealthy started to try to gum up the free markets a bit for their own interests. So maybe you could dive into that a bit.
There's a lot of concern on the ground about gummed up markets, and in particular oligopolies. So depending on who you talk to in Chile, they say, this country is run by 3 families, 4 families, 5 families. And if you do a list of the world's richest people, quite near the top, there are a few Chilean families, and they just own huge swathes of industry. But the real key thing, and this is another point that I hope comes across to readers of the book, I've mentioned sort of academic stuff and the IMF and that kind of thing a few times, but really what I sought to do with this book is to go to the places and to report on the ground, because there's often quite a big disconnect between the story that we think's there through Twitter or think tanks or working papers or whatever, and the actual idea that's on the ground. And the idea that's on the ground in Chile, if you want to understand one thing that's a problem there, and one thing that is going to mean there's going to be continued rioting there until they sort it out, it's quite simply education and the market for education. And this in itself is absolutely fascinating, because jump back to that book, the brick that the Chicago boys put together. One of the key parts of that, it's available online. It's in Spanish. There's an English translation you can find as well. Is a big statement about the equality of opportunity. So they say very explicitly, we want growth. We're going for growth. We're going to shrink the size of the state, but equality is important. But for them, it's equality of opportunity, not of outcome. So it's letting everybody have a chance, not equalizing through taxation. And the way they're going to guarantee this economic opportunity is through education. So that's the plan. Yet now in Chile, one of the people working there described it to me as educational apartheid. There's this incredibly detailed and fine-led system of schools in Santiago, essentially that are part public, part private, where you can pay a kind of top-up fee. And you literally pay for what you get. So I have this chart in the book, and I'll send you it so that you can use it in the podcast recording, which is sort of mind-blowing. And it shows how, as you travel from the center of Santiago out, with every single tube stop that you go along, subway stop you go along, income falls, and also school performance falls. And I did the correlation between these things, and it's like 0.99%. And as an economist, and anyone that's dealt with any data will know, even when there's a really strong relationship, you always get a bit of fuzziness. But this is it's almost guaranteed that the more money you have, you can live in a nicer neighborhood, the school will be better, and you'll achieve a better Simska, they're called, school grade. And this, the sort of hard wiring or between income inequality and educational outcomes is the very root of what's going on in Santiago at the moment. There's a whole new breed of politicians, all now in their sort of mid-30s. Some of them tipped to be future presidents, and they all came to power through various school and high school and then university rebellions over the past 10 years. And it's education that everybody talks about on the ground.
The story that you tell, which is quite convincing, is that education, it has essentially been worked by the well-off in such a way that it basically perpetuates the current state of things, the current income inequality and wealth levels, and it even does so despite the fact that a lot of the new generation that is in these wealthy neighborhoods and is getting the best schooling, they don't necessarily work so hard. It's almost like they're appreciating being at the nice country club or whatever. So maybe you could explain some of that, because to me, this really gets at the idea of the value of what you're doing, of being on the ground. Because if you're just looking at the data, I see it the way that you see it, but just on a function of the data, you have to confront the argument that the income correlates highly with ability, and that also correlates, and then the income correlates with where you live, and that's how you get the correlation. That doesn't seem to square with it doesn't square at all with your chapter, but you have to confront that if you were just looking at the data. But when you put the data together with what you're doing on the ground, for me, the story is convincing.
I'll answer that question, but also along the way, you asked me a little bit about sort of the method and, how I work and sort of put these chapters together. And I don't think there's any great magic to it. It's just something I built up over the years working at The Economist, which is to essentially do a lot of preparatory work, a lot of reading, like 2 or 3 months reading on a place. So all of the data, the names of all the presidents, the regions you're going to go to, have lots and lots of meetings set up for during the visit, so that when you're there on the ground, you can just spend 2 or 3 weeks literally talking to everybody and doing loads of interviews. So I would try to do 8 to 10 interviews a day. Most of the places I went to, I did about 60 interviews. I think that was also the case in Santiago. And through that, just a very non-quantitative methodology, like a more anthropological approach, I guess, if that doesn't sound too pompous, but just building up story after story after story of people until you start to appreciate these patterns. And the pattern in Santiago, the way it comes across immediately, is when you get in a taxi and they say, "I'm here to study the city," the guy just immediately says, "Which city?" And I said, "What do you mean, which city?" And he says, "There's at least 5 cities here in Santiago." And what he meant by that is there's 5 different layers. And that's the kind of statement you get again and again while there. Essentially, to give a bit more color on what the place looks like. It's beautiful, very friendly people and incredible food. So I'd encourage everyone to get there. You're in the foothills of the Andes. And so the whole city is on a slope. And very simply, the expensive properties are at the top of the slope. The cheap ones are at the bottom of the slope. There's a place in the middle called Plaza Italia. And that is like the borderline that the working class and middle class try to stay either side of. And there's this incredibly kind of concerning, I would say, phenomenon of people voluntarily splitting out into separate areas, even when the thing in those areas is a public good or a public asset. So I spoke to some people, for example, who were in the rich area, saying that they found it very difficult. They were newcomers to the country, said that they tried to organise get-togethers. One person told me this. Another tried to organise a picnic in a park, and they couldn't get everybody together in the same park because the people in the office at different income levels wouldn't go to the same park. And this isn't a park you have to pay to get into. It's a public park. But implicitly, there is a language within Santiago, and there's a term, cuique, things are either cuique or non-cuique, and it's like of our class. So it's a thing that is done by our class, our sort of upper class, or not done by the upper class. And that determines the way everybody behaves. And it's really perpetuated by the education system, where because of the way the market works, the market both for pupils and for teachers, things over time have sorted into just a very clear slicing, where depending on how well you do, you'll get a certain income. You pitch yourself to that school, they'll take you or they won't take you, and you're more or less guaranteed results that will allow you to stay on that point on the ladder. Somebody described it to me as an educational war. Life in Santiago was an educational war. And it's because education and income are so tightly linked. And then those two things are so tightly linked to all this other softer social stuff about how social infrastructure, transport networks, parks, which restaurants you go to, work in the city.
The inequality has only lately boiled over into social disorder. Is that fair? Is that right?
Yes and no. So there have been concerns for a long time. So to jump back to sort of the heyday, as it were, of people praising Chile, it was clear that you could see inequality was rising back at the turn of the millennium. And this concern over schools actually started in 2006. There was something called the Penguins Revolt, or the Penguins Rebellion, and that's because it started with high school kids, and high school kids in Santiago all wear pretty much the same uniform. It's like a white front with the black lapels, and so people jokingly call them penguins. It's like a little nickname for school kids. And there was this high school rebellion, and then I think about 5 years later there was the Chilean winter, which was that cohort had basically become university kids, and there was a big university student-led marches and so on. And that group, the heads of the student politics is a big thing in Chile in a way I don't think it used to be, but isn't anymore in the US and UK. And the head of both the University of Chile and the Catholic University of Chile, their representatives, student unions, became members of parliament and are now heads, and they're now sort of getting into their mid 30s and are now heads of political parties, and are really shaking up the way that Chilean politics works. So yes, the latest demonstrations late last year were the worst and the most violent, but you could actually see this coming like a decade out. This movement around education and anger around education is at least a decade old.
Some of the protests of the last year, the immediate cause was related to public transport fees. Is that? Yeah,
but that's exactly what I mean about how you've kind of got to go there and sort of understand the place. And I had a quick call with the friends and people I had met when I was there, just to check, that the story hadn't changed, and they all said that it happened. So yes, it was a hike in the subway fee. Subway's like everybody uses it; it's really, really crammed, and so it annoys people. But that was the match. But the underlying fuel, is much more this educational war. And the underlying fuel for that is basically the failure of this ideal of economic, the opportunity, equality of opportunity, which was supposed to be like a core of the Chilean model, and it just hasn't turned out to be.
So the equality of opportunity was supposed to come from a relatively free market way of doing education, which is almost like Milton Friedman's ideas of education vouchers and things like this, right?
Yeah, it's exactly that model. Exactly that model.
And in the U.S., we've experimented it, but not on a only in local areas, and it hasn't been successful enough to go to other areas. But the Chilean example is worrisome, and from the American perspective, I find Santiago an interesting example because obviously concerns about inequality are starting to boil over now, and in Chile, you have what was intended to be a very free market for education that was supposed to create equality of opportunity. The free market fails because it essentially becomes politicized and captured by the upper class. And then in the US, I think a lot of our problems relate to the fact that we have these ostensibly free financial markets, but the financial markets have become politicized, and the well-off in the US use financial markets to enrich themselves because these markets have become deeply politicized, and basically the well-off get bailed out at every turn, and people that don't own financial assets get no benefit from that. So it's interesting that you have these things that are held up as like, this is very free and it's going to lead to equality of opportunity, but actually they become captured and it leads to exactly the opposite. The other interesting parallel, I think, is that in Chile, the recent social disorder was caused by this very modest increase in public transport costs. But in the book, you sort of preview it a bit because you say that the lower income people in Chile, they have a real problem with cash flow. They're always like having zero cash. Yeah. And you note that it comes in part because similar to the case in the US, we have a very well-developed financial system if you're rich, but a very poor financial system if you're poor. Like a lot of the very poor in the US, they don't have bank accounts, they do payday lenders, and it's like very inefficient way of dealing with money. And you say in Chile, it's a similar system of like payday type loans, and there's basically very, very little cash flow. And then it's exacerbated in Chile by the education issue, where a lot of the people that basically had poor educational results had borrowed money to go to school. There's a parallel in the US where in the US, half of all people who start their college education finish. But at Harvard, it's 99%. At all the top 25 schools, it's like above 95%. And then at some very expensive schools that cater to the low end, it's sometimes 20%. Yeah. So some of those people are getting the worst of all possible worlds, where they're taking on huge loans, not high interest, but huge loans, and then they're not finishing the degree. You noticed a decent bit of that.
Yeah, so this issue of cash flow and of sort of week-to-week poverty is a really important one, and it's one that the people who put the system in place fail to see. So I was lucky enough to spend some time with Rolf Luders. He was the finance minister of the country, trained in Chicago, and his view very clearly said it to me, and he's on record saying it, and he would be prepared to defend it at any point, is just, I delivered growth, and just look at what happened to poverty. Poverty fell away. But the problem is that when you go and talk to the poorest working class areas, You meet people who officially, in terms of the statistics, and this is just an example of how measurement and our obsession with statistics and things can bias our picture, means that they're officially not poor. So the minimum wage is set at a level that most of the women I interviewed in those communities were on the minimum wage. Whenever I asked them, how much do you earn, they always would just laugh and say, la minima, like, I'm on the minimum wage, how would I get paid anything else? And if you added into to their salary what a typical their husband's salary that I also talked to, you'd see it's just below the definition of what it is, just above rather the definition of what it is to be poor and the definition of where you get aid. So that means that in the statistics, those people aren't classed as poor, they don't have any aid, but the level of their inequality, and this is the really striking thing, you actually start to realize that inequality that sharp actually breeds poverty. What I mean by that is those areas, there's such a difference between income between the rich and poor areas for lots of things. Great example would be bookshops and pharmacies. They don't even bother to locate in the low income areas. And so the impact, because the people there have low income, it's not a very fruitful area to locate. The impact of that is if you're a person needing a medicine in a rich area, you might be able to just walk to the pharmacy or take a cycle there. So your time cost of getting there is zero, your travel cost is zero. If you're in a poor area, you have to travel across Santiago, which is very difficult, to get hold of medicines or to get hold of books. And so that and a whole system of examples like it, like a lack of access to credit, which means people just borrow from their local shop week by week, and then that shop charges them an interest rate in a kind of payday lending sort of scheme. There's a whole list of things that I found which basically mean that really perplexing and problematic thing, which is that the lower income people actually pay more for their staples than high income people do. And that's really, as an economist, you started off, we were talking about, are markets good or do they work well? Wherever you are on the spectrum and you think how markets should work, that isn't the way things are supposed to work. It isn't supposed to be that the people with the lowest income pay the highest rates and end up having to trek across cities to get basic goods like simple drugs and textbooks.
It's fascinating. And actually, John Kenneth Galbraith, who no one talks about anymore, but his books, they're very fun reads. I find them. He talks frequently about this problem and about how with more equal income, you actually get better consumer goods because you get right in the middle of the market. And it as it relates to consumer goods and services, it's very inefficient to have a lot of inequality because you get exactly this problem that you're talking about, where the consumer goods manufacturers, they follow dollars, not people, and you get very, very strange and inefficient, societally inefficient allocations of energy. Again,
let's see if I'm right. I mean, this may not happen anywhere else, but it may already be happening in the US. I'm not sure, but Chile is like ahead of everyone. Santiago is ahead of everyone down this path. I was 20, 30 years now into this experiment. And what I found, like potentially the ultimate reason that you would say that the Chicago experiment failed, is that in whole communas, like whole sectors of the city, Communist Party politicians have got into power and are themselves having to provide these basic goods and services through a command and control economy method. So I met the communist mayor of a borough called Recoleta. His name's Daniel Jadot. He's big on Twitter. You can find him on Twitter. And he set up this people's pharmacy. And, credit to the guy. He just sort of sits there with this list of prices. Chile really only has 3 pharmacies. It's kind of oligopolistic. with their prices for these essential drugs, and then the prices at which he can buy them, and they're, you know, a tenth of the price. And so in this city that was supposed to be the bastion of Chicago school economics, you've got a communist mayor providing pharmaceutical goods, and that's, you know, that's what's currently happening in Chile. So it's just an example of how far from the ideal that city has gone.
Now, when you get to the politics, for me, the Latin American lesson is that economics are one thing, but the real trouble comes when people don't get along. Like the real reason that various Latin American countries have fallen off trajectory is not really that they've gotten the economics wrong. They just couldn't keep people getting along. The politics didn't work. And you're suggesting that maybe Chile is getting close to that part where the politics sort of falls apart. Certainly, as an American, it feels like we are teetering dangerously, and our politics are on the verge of breaking. And I wonder, in Chile, do you get the sense that things are near a breaking point, or you think that Chileans, they have the reputation as the most reserved of the Latins? So is it likely that they're just going to talk their way through this, or if the inequality gets worse, do you think it hits a boiling point? It's of interest from the U.S. point of view because this summer, as you've no doubt observed, we've reached the boiling point, and we couldn't. Things were on the verge of not working in key cities.
That's like the question, isn't it? It's not just an interesting question, it's the question. I think that there's an interesting parallel, and I'm an outsider in both places, so you'll be able better to comment on this than me, but I'll just float it as an idea. I think there's an interesting parallel in Santiago, for example, in the US, which is very different than I would say to the UK, which is that there are different tiers of power. Like the big thing that people in Europe don't understand or are shocked by when you get to the US, given the way we see US politics played to us over here, is just how powerful the states are and just how powerful state governors are, and how you can have like different minimum wages in different states, right? That's not something that we would ever countenance in the UK. And similarly in Chile, like I just explained that example of how, you know, there's a very right-wing, centre-right, I guess you'd say, president, and the sort of right and the more market-friendly sector of the political elite are in power at the country level, but it's still possible in a major segment of Santiago, the capital city, for a local communist mayor to take charge and to provide these pharmaceutical goods. And so you were asking about boiling point, and I think that if it weren't for that, so if it were just you had this top-down power, and in the US, if it were just that you had one set of decrees coming out of Washington DC on, you know, minimum wage, look at approach to drug legalization, alcohol, the regulation of gambling, something I know you've talked about in your podcast. There's actually a lot of freedom in both countries for there to be different policies at a local level. And I think that surely is a sort of insurance against things boiling over. And if it weren't for that, things would be closer to boiling point, because it means that if you're that angry in your local neighborhood, at least you've got a chance of changing your local politician and changing some local policy, even if you can't affect the federal or the national policy.
Well, that's very interesting, and it's also scary from the American point of view, because in the grand history, what you're saying is exactly true. You had the Hamiltonian versus Jeffersonian divide, and you reached a compromise, and then You had the Andrew Jackson era where you went back to the States, and you had the whole history, which has basically held up pretty well, where you had a decent bit of power at the state governments. My belief is that that's no longer true. And it might be hard to see from your perspective or from the non-American perspective, but I think that has fallen apart, and it's fallen apart for a very simple reason. It's because state governments are required to balance their budgets. They're not allowed to run persistent long-term deficits in the way that the federal government is. And the COVID crisis has meant that there's now very large structural deficits for all of the states. Those deficits were always in the cards anyway because of demographics, but COVID has accelerated it and made it where structurally these state governments are going to have very large deficits. So that basically puts all the power currently at the federal government, because everyone knows that the federal government is going to have to cover those deficits, and it just gives the government all the power in how the money's used, and it basically gives all the power to the federal government, and that's just the way it is. Right.
That's interesting. That's really interesting.
No, because now, I mean, all of these states that we knew had fiscal troubles, I mean, it's just a disaster. It's just a red ink disaster. And we haven't even gotten far enough along in COVID management to talk about exactly what we're going to do. But the large city and state bailouts are coming. And it gets, I'm sure you've read recently controversies about how Trump, in his management of COVID, he finally came up with a detailed plan, but then realized that the biggest breakouts of COVID were in Democratic states with Democratic governors. So he decided not to implement his plan so that he could then blame it on. It's kind of messy right now in the US. So for me, I read the Santiago chapter with obvious extreme interest. I would like to touch on some other chapters. With regard to demographics, you went to Akita, Japan. I love Japan. On my 40th birthday trip, I went to Japan. Fascinated by it. I was shocked by your chapter in that you did have these ghost cities, and you can already see extreme change in Japan because of aging. The questions that I wanted to ask you there, Japan is distinctive, and the Japanese are so civil, and that country, it's likely to keep working and to get through problems in a way that other countries maybe won't be able to. And I wonder what parts of dealing with an aging population you think are generally instructive, and which parts you think are sort of distinctively Japanese.
So the reason I went to Japan, like with all of the chapters, I basically picked a topic which I think is important, and then tried to go to the global cutting edge, like the leading edge, the place where this issue was most pressing. And just because of the way the demographics have worked out, Japan is that place, and within Japan, Akita is the prefecture. And on the Japanese being civil and polite and kind of well-mannered and so on, I think, again, it's one of those things where, of course, there's some reason for that reputation, but also when you get there and you just spend a few weeks talking to people, you find that most people around the world are pretty much the same. So I was a little bit concerned. I thought, I'm going to be asking these difficult questions about the country. maybe they won't want to sort of open up and talk about it. And that's just not the case at all. The Japanese are up for gossip and complaining about their politicians and anger and just as everyone in the US or UK would be. And the thing that comes up all of the time, and it goes directly to your question about this sort of reputation for civility and respect, is a term they call Sedai Kan Kakusa. And the three kanji basically mean between generations and unfairness. And it translates as intergenerational inequality. And the reason that's interesting is that even in this country that has a reputation, much of it well-deserved and to do with Confucian ethics, I guess, for respect for one's forebearers, for respect for the elders. So even in a country where you would expect people to keep quiet and not to complain about intergenerational inequality, everyone's talking about it. And the reason that everyone's talking about it is the pension and the healthcare system, and the idea that the younger generation, basically the millennial and generation below. I spent a good deal of time in Akita doing like a round table at the university there, talking to university kids to sort of gauge the views. They realize that they're paying into a pension system that is more generous than the one that they will get their pensions out of. And they realize the same thing about healthcare, and they're annoyed about it. So my point to your question, like how much of this is peculiarly Japanese, what I'm saying is, if that happens in a country where people are generally respectful of their elders and will do things to support the kind of dynastic family set up, well, in countries where those views are a bit looser and people are more ready to complain about the elderly, I think we'd see it even more sharply.
To tangent a little bit, I think that in the US, a lot of the inequality discussion is actually tied up with aging, and you've got this peculiar situation where the older people control all the wealth, but because of breaking of family ties and improved healthcare and so forth, they know that they're going to live a long time, and they feel the need to really protect what they have. And so you have this kind of extreme generational divide that stems from the old just having a very understandable desire to want to protect what they have for this unknown, very long life.
And I think that's definitely going to be the case in the US and in the UK and, all other advanced economies. For what it's worth, what I saw on that issue, i.e. the question of long lives, so enhanced lifespan, which is one of two big drivers. It's not the only one. It's the first of kind of two pillars of demographics. Is I came away pretty optimistic on that. And it's kind of for exactly the reason you just said, which is that the elderly have all the assets. They have all the housing. They have these big pensions. Of course, there's big questions about pensioner poverty, but on average, that generation has become very wealthy. And so in a market economy, getting back to the question of markets, what's the natural thing that happens? And when you look carefully around Japan, you can just see everywhere innovations, literally innovations to the built environment, extra rails being put up in public conveniences, like near the ATMs, there's a little clip so you can put your walking stick so while you use the ATM. Everywhere as you go around that country, you can see how the wants and needs of the elderly generation are creating a new market. There's a new market for different types of golf clubs, different types of shoes, all of these things. And many of the young people I spoke to were working in those industries. So it becomes the economy essentially is a place where people with wants and needs and the ability to fulfill those needs can meet and trade. And so there are big concerns. I don't want to downplay it, but in a sense, that's what economics and economies are all about, dealing with that kind of problem. the second pillar of demographics, which is basically that places are going to vanish because of falling birth rates, I actually became aware, and after mulling it over, was much more disturbed about, because what happens in these places is something we don't talk about as economists or policymakers, which is just a complete freeze. By which I mean, so take a market that everyone understands and everybody talks about, housing markets. It's not the case that in these disappearing villages, as in the great financial crash of 2008, in the US and UK, the price of housing plummeted, but then the market cleared, by which I mean that the buyers and sellers could meet at a lower price, and people made losses, but the market continued to work. In these places, the market just ceases to exist. There's no price at all at which you can sell a house, and it just freezes. And it goes further than just markets, because there's going to be no future to this village or this town. There's no incentive or need to get involved in local politics. And so Japan now has a problem of all these local elections going completely uncontested, because everyone knows that everyone in that village is really elderly. So why would you want to become mayor and work on a 10-year policy plan when the place isn't going to exist anymore? So this sort of like economics and social shift of literally disappearing rather than aging is something that I think we should focus on more, and kind of try and separate out from those worn questions of pensions and healthcare. Very important, but the economics of just like complete disappearance of a place, I think, is new and different.
You have a very dark element to that chapter, which is you talk about elderly suicides and the phenomena of older Japanese people just being lonely and killing themselves. And I wonder if you have insight into what that's coming from. I mean, we assume that it's less likely in ones that have deep family roots. We assume that it's less likely if people feel like they do have a good pension and do have good retirement assets. What is the cause of it? And have you looked for similar phenomena in other societies? Wonder if you could talk to that a bit.
Yeah, of course. Kudo Koshi, I'm probably making a mess of that, but it means lonely death, and it's a real problem and kind of growing phenomenon. It is, as with many socioeconomic problems, it's linked with the standard things that you would worry about, such as income. That doesn't tell the whole story though, and the kind of the softer side of it. I spoke to some people that really told me a lot about it, actually, as I spoke to this great bunch of people in Akita who were the over 70s football league. And this is what I mean about the aging thing becoming, we shouldn't necessarily be negative about it. Just as a quick aside, like pick any age, like over 80s. I don't know if there's an over 90s, but there's loads of teams and groups and things for people who are only over this certain age, because reaching these elevated ages has become something of a kind of badge of honor. And anyway, these guys in the over 70s football team were saying how important their team is to them, even if they run really slowly compared to when they're young and the game isn't as good quality, because it's a way of checking each week that everyone turns up. And if the people don't turn up, I mean, they just said it out to me, it means that the guy may have died. And the linked phenomenon, I guess, is the a rise in divorce rates and the kind of breakdown of the nuclear Japanese family, which sociologists over the years have had written many a book on, but the very stereotypical Japanese family where the man was called the salary man, and his aim was to work for Toyota or Yamaha or one of the big offices of state, and the woman was known as the education mama. She took the income and managed the children's education. And what happened, a few people told me, is that people just didn't expect to live so long. They had no role models. And within a generation, life expectancy went from about 65 to 85. and these people had these hugely elevated retirements that they hadn't expected. Many of them got divorced, and so you end up with a lot of very elderly and lonely single people. And those are people that in the world of policy we should worry about. So I don't know for sure whether this phenomenon exists in the UK, but I remember from my time in policy, sometimes you see those charts showing kind of income deciles. And I remember when I first started out, I always assumed that the worst off, the hardest hit people in that first decile would be like a kind of single mother with a couple of kids, no job, and so on. When you look into it, those people are always tend to be in like the third decile. The people right at the bottom are often single, elderly, no job, low pension, no relatives. And yeah, you need to be very, very concerned about those people. And they're coming up with innovative new ways to look at it, including using movement sensors and AI things that look on people's driveways to see, has this been swept, are newspapers building up? But it's a dark and kind of growing social phenomenon there for sure.
And the chapter, I mean, it has hints of optimism, but pretty dire chapter in a lot of ways. So I've taken up a lot of your time. I want to ask you one finishing question. In the book, you write about 9 areas. I regret that I can't ask you about Tallinn, Estonia, because that seems like it was a lot of fun, and it seems like a fascinating place. I would love to visit. But I'm curious. I have my guesses because some of the places that you went, they might have been a little bit taxing. I would imagine that the Syrian refugee camp was an adventure, but also quite taxing. I would imagine that Angola, which I'm a native New Orleanian, very familiar with that area. Glasgow, Kinshasa, Darien. These might have been a little bit more taxing. So I'm guessing that it might have been the Akita, Santiago, Tallinn area. But what chapter was the most enjoyable to research and write?
Well, I really liked, and I'm very glad that you picked up that the book's a kind of combination of travel and economics, because it was a risk. I could have made it more economicsy and have kind of more working papers and facts and figures and less of this kind of storytelling travelogue approach. So, that was something that I enjoyed. It's something I hadn't done before. And because of that, the places that were the really difficult trips, I think, were the most enjoyable. And in an odd way, I'm going to say Kinshasa. Kinshasa is really difficult to get into. The Congolese visa system is an absolute nightmare. They don't particularly want journalists going there, and it's this city. It's a village basically of 10 million people. It should be the best city on earth. It's one of the worst on any measure: poverty, childhood life expectancy, pick your measure. Yet the people there are unbelievably open. I got shown around. I got taken into people's churches. I got taken into countless houses for food, and just absolutely keen to kind of have their story told. A lot of places you go to, and particularly when there's like a political thing involved, people will say at the end, "Oh, just call me Mr. Smith," or if they say a particular thing that's a bit kind of risky, they say, well, let's have that bit off the record. The vast majority of stuff ended up on the record. But like these people in Kinshasa, where the government is known to sort of clamp down on people that speak out, at the end of the interview, people would say, put this in your book. I want to be in the book. I want the world to know about this country and what's going wrong. And for me as an economist, the serious point, more people need to understand what's happening in the Congo is the economic crisis of the past century. And the fact that the people there are so open and wanting to improve things and willing to talk about it was, without wanting to go over the top on it, it was kind of a life-changing experience. Like, I'll be going back there as soon as I can and doing other projects in economics there because of that trip. So I'd say Congo, Kinshasa.
I love it.
The food and music are also amazing, which kind of helps.
That's the reason to travel.
Yeah.
Well, I deeply appreciate this. You've been extremely generous with your time.
No problem.
Such a good book. All right. So I recommend to everyone, follow Richard at RD Economist, at RD_Economist.
_Economist, yeah.
Go to Amazon and buy Extreme Economies. All right. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Brandon.